I mentioned in the most recent Community Redraw episode that last year I read like 19 volumes of Demon Slayer intending to make a video around it, then just kinda didn't end up doing that. And I waited long enough now that I'd forgotten a bunch of the different plot points and characters and stuff, so this week I started watching the Demon Slayer anime. And it's really great, and the second they mentioned the Demon Slayer core, it immediately got me thinking about the Green Lantern core. And from there, a whole bunch of different fusion ideas started spawning and spilling out, and it gave me all the ideas for today's episode. Let's get into it, shall we? Let's go. Hit like if you want, subscribe if you feel like, but either way, enjoy the show. Tanjiro Jordan lived a fairly simple life with his mother and many younger siblings. They all lived a few mile hike up a mountain from the nearest town, and he'd spend most days getting up early to hike down, work in town, help those that needed it with whatever tasks he could, then bring his earnings back to his family. Though he was also a highly skilled horse rider, despite not having a horse himself, and would occasionally make extra earnings at the Ferris racetracks. Of course, he'd sometimes lose money as well betting on himself. He was a largely kind and helpful young man, but he could also be more than a little cocky. He sometimes yearned for a slightly more adventurous life, but when that kind of life finally found him, he regretted ever hoping for it. One day, he'd worked late enough that it had gotten dark, and he'd been convinced to sleep in town and head home in the morning. The next day, he awoke, marched up the mountain, only to find his home torn to shreds, with the lush green forest tainted with splatters of blood. His mother, his siblings, they'd all been massacred. He ran to each of them in desperation, one by one, hoping, praying that maybe one of them had clung to life. The final member of his family he checked was the eldest of his siblings besides himself, Nezuko. Despite the devastation he was facing, his heart leapt when he felt a thin stream of air pass from her lips. He quickly hurled her over his shoulders, but just as he started running with her towards town to get help, he felt her arm tighten around his neck. He quickly started to choke and then realized that he was being lifted off the ground. Nezuko's now clawed hand reached around and gripped his neck, turning him around, with them both now hovering up above the lowest layer of trees. Tanjiro was horrified to see Nezuko had yellow, veiny light spilling from her eyes. She said nothing to him as an eerie glow emitted from her and became brighter and brighter. Her blood-soaked clothes were suddenly coated over with a yellow uniform that seemed to spawn out of nowhere. Tanjiro was confused and terrified, and the more afraid he became, the more Nezuko drooled from her now toothed mouth. She opened her maw wide, and yellow light started spilling out of Tanjiro towards her. It instantly started making him feel weak, but even still he told her whatever was happening, he'd help her solve it. He'd save her. He locked eyes with her, and she suddenly clamped her mouth shut. But still, more drool spilled from her mouth as she stared at him, and she seemed to be struggling to keep her lips sealed. Before Tanjiro could get a sense of what she might do next, her eyes suddenly darted aside, and in an instant, she dropped him. The second he left her grip, a green streak of light leapt out of a nearby tree and shot into Nezuko, tackling her from the air. Tanjiro landed clumsily on the ground, but instantly ran towards a man that was wielding a glowing green sword raised above his head, who was now holding Nezuko's neck, facing away from himself. The man had a green suit that somewhat resembled Nezuko's, and a purple mask sitting on the side of his head. He had a stoic, near emotionless expression as he started to swing his blade before noticing that Tanjiro was running in to tackle him. He twirled his blade, and suddenly a glowing green burst of water erupted from the ground and hit Tanjiro, knocking him onto his back. Tanjiro was winded and confused by what had just hit him, but was instantly back on his feet, charging at the man, yelling at him not to harm his sister. Tanjiro grabbed the bottom of the hilt of the man's blade and tried to yank it away, but his tugs were completely ineffective, and the man just stood there, rolling his eyes. The man said that the blade would do no good in Tanjiro's hands. Even still, while holding the blade, Tanjiro kept tugging, then leaned his head back and headbutted the man, only managing to hurt his own head. The man suddenly headbutted Tanjiro back. While still gripping the blade, Tanjiro let out a painful cry. At the sound, Nezuko suddenly lashed her elbow back, hammering it into the man's stomach. He choked through the hit, and his grip on her and his blade slipped. Nezuko tore herself free and Tanjiro stumbled back, now wielding the blade. The man rolled his eyes again, reaching his hand out towards his blade before retreating the gesture. Nezuko wasn't attacking Tanjiro, but was poised, ready to fight alongside him, and the blade, now in Tanjiro's hand, while it briefly swirled into a black hue, quickly turned back and ignited once again into vibrant green light. Tanjiro demanded that the man tell him what was going on and who he was. The man held out his hand again, and the blade suddenly ripped free from Tanjiro's grip and back into his own, but he quickly sheathed it. He told Tanjiro that his name was Abin Tomioka, and that he was a member of the Lantern Slayer Corps, a group charged with hunting down and slaying the demons of Lesser Lantern Lights. Abin claimed that Tanjiro's sister had been turned into a demon of the yellow light, and that she'd now have an undying yearning to instill fear in all she crossed by whatever means necessary, so that she could then drink that fearful energy from them, sucking out their life force and killing all she consumed. But also that she was showing a shocking level of restraint. Tanjiro pleaded for Abin to tell him a way to reverse whatever had been done to make Nezuko this way. Abin said he knew of no such way to turn someone back, but that he may know someone who did. Abin cautiously let them both go and told Tanjiro that if he let Nezuko kill anyone, he'd have to come and hunt them both down. But all the same, he gave them directions to go find one of the greatest and certainly the toughest Lantern Slayer trainers around, Kilowog. The journey to Kilowog took a week. It would have been far longer if they'd traveled by foot, but Tanjiro spent almost all his family's earnings on a horse so that they could ride there faster. Early in the week, he many times grew scared that he'd never be able to turn Nezuko back to normal. But he noticed that any time that he'd let those thoughts creep in, Nezuko would get more restless and salivate more and more. After the first day, she'd even use her unusual abilities granted to her from her new form to make herself a mouth guard. Becoming a demon of yellow light had seemingly stripped her of her ability to speak anyhow, so Tanjiro had to guess that her focusing on having this guard in her mouth would keep her disciplining herself from trying to consume his fear or anyone else's. All the same, he made sure that through the rest of their journey, any time his thoughts would turn fearful, he'd immediately focus on something more hopeful to ensure her cravings weren't further triggered by him. An incredible amount of willpower was needed by both of them on that journey, which would be very good practice for what lay ahead. When Tanjiro and Nezuko finally got to the base of the mountain they'd been instructed to seek, they found a small home. Tanjiro quietly called in, announcing his presence, but before an answer came from within, suddenly a figure shot down behind him, quaking the earth. The hulking figure was a burly, 7-foot-tall man with a pig-like red mask, wearing green attire similar to what Abin had worn. He grabbed Tanjiro by the shirt collar and lifted him into the air, saying,
"So you're the little poozer that thinks he's gonna turn a filthy demon of yellow light back into a human, huh?"
He glanced at Nezuko, who was angrily poised to strike, but was holding back.
"Could be worse, she could be a demon of red light, but still, not an easy task. You want any hope of turning her normal? First, you gotta complete the Lantern Slayer training, with me. If by some miracle you manage to survive that, you then have to go to Mount Oa and live through the Guardian selection trial. Then, finally, if you make it through that, you'll have to find the very man who turned your sister into a demon in the first place. The leader of the demons of the yellow light, who carries the yellow lantern of fear, has killed more people than any other demon, and somehow make him turn your sister back. Personally, I bet you don't even make it through step 1, so if you want to turn back, now's the time."
But Tanjiro was determined. He was willing to commit every ounce of life he had left to finding a way to fix his sister. And so, training began, not just for Tanjiro, but for Nezuko as well. Kilowog spent the next 2 years putting Tanjiro through grueling training designed specifically to exhaust and terrify him. Nezuko went through it alongside him, having to keep herself from breaking and drinking the fear-drenched life force from her brother. Kilowog was a brutal instructor, and Tanjiro spent much of the early months hating him. But As time went on, he saw the glimpses of compassion coming through. Kilowog had to try and break him at every turn to ensure Tanjiro proved he had the will to go on no matter what. You see, during these years of physical training, Tanjiro and Nezuko were also being taught the history of the various light energies and the emotions that fueled each one. 1,000 years ago, a group of guardians watched over the Lanterns of Light, each of which contained an ability to grant powers to a being who embodied the emotion tied to each light. Some lanterns focused on higher vibrational emotions and others on lesser, but the guardians felt it best to keep all of them sealed away. To help them in guarding these lanterns, they imbued a select few with blades forged in the green light of will. But one of the chosen protectors was soon tempted by the yellow light of fear. He knew how easy it was to elicit fear in people, and he knew that he could become infinitely more powerful with a weapon forged from yellow light. But the guardians refused to give him such power from a lower emotion. Eventually, he turned on them and stole the yellow lantern. He then used it to create demons of yellow light, imbuing people with the yellow energy so they could spread across the world, causing more and more fear, making him and his followers more and more powerful. Eventually, other lanterns were stolen as well. The red light of rage was taken across the seas, though some still seek its return. The orange light of greed or avarice vanished and hadn't been seen in centuries. Eventually, the Guardians realized they needed more than a small group of protectors, and they created the Lantern Slayer Corps, using the green light of will. They made hundreds of blades from the light, blades which would only work in the hands of someone with immense willpower already, and further still would change colors if held by a being fueled by a lesser emotion, to reveal what sorts of thoughts dominated their minds. Tanjiro had been willful enough to light Abin's blade green even before his training, but after those 2 years on the mountain, when he held Kilowodaki's blade, it shone that much more brightly as a beacon of willpower. He was finally ready for the Guardians' selection trial. Nezuko remained with Kilowog as Tanjiro set off for Mount Oa. When he arrived there, there were 24 other trainees, all wielding their own green blades of will, though some glowed brighter than others. The group was told they'd have to survive for 1 week on the mountain, and that it was covered in demons of various lesser lights, most yellow, but some red. The territory they had to move in covered miles and miles, and Tanjiro even thought there was a chance he may not even see a demon. But that was quickly proven very wrong. In the first 2 hours, he had to slay 4 demons, 3 of yellow light and 1 of red. Despite them trying all they could to scare him or make him angry, he stayed focused and had total concentration on maintaining his willpower, and his blade spawned with tendrils and eruptions of green light to help him slay the various beings. But soon, he would be faced with a foe unlike anything else he'd seen. Another Slayer was running for his life, his blade dimmed to almost nothing, as a colossal demon charged on after him, not of yellow light or red light. In fact, this one carried above his head in one of his dozens and dozens of arms, the Orange Lantern of Greed. Tanjiro couldn't understand how one of the lanterns could have been right under the noses of the Demon Slayer Corps, but either way he leapt into action, as the orange beast shot out an arm and grabbed the other fleeing Slayer. It pulled the flailing swordsman towards its mouth, but Tanjiro shot straight through the air and sliced its hand off. Tanjiro landed, blade at the ready again, as the other Slayer flopped to the earth, then just ran off. Tanjiro ignored him and demanded to know where this demon had gotten the Orange Lantern. The beast snickered and told him he'd stolen it centuries ago, but hadn't granted its power to anyone else. He'd wanted it all for himself, for nobody else to wield the power of the orange light. He'd hidden away in a place he knew the Slayers would never think to look for him, their precious Mount Oa. Here he'd be brought young trainee lanterns to consume constantly, and their deaths wouldn't be questioned, as few survived the trials anyhow. The more he consumed, the stronger he became, and now it was Tanjiro's turn to fuel his might. It lashed its many arms out at Tanjiro, and each one that came for him he sliced off, but more and more would grow back in their place. Soon, he noticed just before they'd grow back, the orange lantern would flicker with extra light. With that knowledge, Tanjiro stopped slashing and evading and instead leapt on to one of the arms and held tight. It yanked right back towards the demon, which shot another cascade of hands at him. Just before one of them could grab him, he leapt off his perch and sliced straight through the raised arm above the demon, holding the lantern. The lantern tumbled through the air and the beast suddenly shrieked and thrashed its arms all about. Tanjiro used all his force to kick the lantern out of the air across the forest. The demon immediately ignored the boy and ran right after it. With its focus no longer on him, Tanjiro got an opening at its head. He summoned all his will into his blade and it burst into an emerald aura of spewing energy. He leapt straight at his foe and with a single swipe, cut its head clean off. With a desperate, gargled cry, the creature's body and head withered to ashes and vanished. Tanjiro spent the rest of the week guarding the Orange Lantern from other demons, and upon the conclusion of the trial, he returned it to the not-so-surprised Guardians. It turned out they'd known about the beast that held it and the lantern's location, but thought it a fitting addition to the challenge of the trials. Tanjiro was then officially accepted into the Corps, with special acclaim for having slain the being known as Larfleeze of the Many Hands. He didn't waste any time celebrating, and quickly returned to Kilowog and Nezuko. His trainer was deeply proud of the boy, admitting that he thought there was a fair chance he wouldn't make it, even after all their time prepping. Kilowog told Tanjiro that he'd make a fine Lantern Slayer, and that he and Nezuko were truly ready to go after the wielder of the Yellow Lantern, the one who'd turned Nezuko and all other demons of yellow light. The two set off to finally hunt down Muzan Sinestro. I didn't go into this episode thinking that I was going to make some of my best art ever, but I think that Tanjiro Nezuko drawing is probably the best drawing I've done this year, at least in the, top tier of drawings. And I definitely have a few ideas for what I could do with a potential sequel. I really like the idea of Inosuke mixed with Guy Gardner. I think that's kind of a funny fusion. And of course, Muzan Sinestro. But I won't base the decision on whether or not to do a sequel to this based on view count alone. Instead, I'll base it on if there's a bunch of really good ideas for a sequel. I have two that I like, but I want to hear what other suggestions you all have in the comments. Because there's tons of you out there that know Demon Slayer and Green Lantern better than I do, so maybe you've got better ideas than I have. And of course, if you're new to the channel, I don't have a ton of Demon Slayer stuff on here yet, but if you like anime and DC fusions, maybe you'd like my A Bat on Titan video. Or maybe Naruto in Space. That one's similar to this, but without the DC influence. But besides that, that's all for today, except of course for ending this video on some kind of positive or uplifting note. And the thought I want to leave people today is my own interpretation of something I've heard Matthew McConaughey say in a motivational speech, which is that his hero is him 10 years from now. And then when he gets 10 years older, his new hero is him another 10 years later. And I really like that idea, but for me personally, my hero is actually me 4 years ago. The one who started Popcross Studios and was dedicated and committing to getting it built and working through all of the problems that came along with trying to make this channel a thing. Because now I'm reaping the benefits of all the work that old me put in. So now today I try to do things so that future me can look back on this time and say, thank you to old me for doing all this work to help me be healthier and happier and whatever else today. I mean, today and the future. You get what I mean, hopefully. I hope that's helpful to someone out there. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. I love you all, and I'll see you all in the next episode on Friday. Goodbye.